Daniel Turner always believed there wasn't a machine he couldn't fix. He had grown up in small-town garages, helping his father patch old Chevys and tractors that should have died decades ago. Now, at 34, he worked 12-hour shifts at a fading auto shop on the edge of town. He never complained. He had bigger reasons to stay strong. His 8-year-old son, Mason, depended on him for everything. Lunches packed with care, late-night homework, help, warm dinners made with whatever leftovers he could find. They survived. Paycheck to paycheck, but carried hope tucked in their pockets. Every day after work, Daniel picked Mason up from the school across town. They would walk the cracked sidewalks home, Mason skipping ahead, waving at passing cars. One Tuesday evening, they took a different route. Mason tugged his father's hand, pointing at the giant glass building that glowed even as the sky dimmed to twilight. "Dad, look! That's Parker Tech!" Mason's eyes sparkled at the name everyone in their town knew. Gregory Parker, the man whose face smiled from charity banners and business magazines. The genius CEO who turned simple gadgets into billion-dollar innovations. Through the spotless glass walls, they saw bright lights and white floors that made Daniel suddenly conscious of the grease stains on his shirt. But Mason pressed closer, eyes wide, nose smudging the clean glass. Inside, Daniel saw her, a young girl in a motorized wheelchair, her hair tied back with a yellow ribbon, her small hands resting awkwardly on the armrest controls. She seemed alone in the vast, shining lobby except for a nurse, quietly standing nearby. When Mason waved, the girl's eyes lifted, shy but curious, and her fingers twitched up in return. Daniel gently pulled Mason back, murmuring apologies to the nurse who came over to close the blinds. They left, but the girl's eyes stayed with him all the way home. That night, while Mason drifted to sleep clutching his battered teddy bear, Daniel lay awake staring at the peeling paint above his bed. He thought of the girl's stiff fingers, the awkward tilt of her shoulders, the way hope flickered when she saw Mason wave. He thought about how many things he'd repaired with scrap metal and stubbornness, and wondered if broken people were really so different. The next morning, Daniel clocked out of his shift early, leaving his boss scratching his head. He picked Mason up from school with a plan forming faster than he could. You doubt it. Mason clutched his hand as they crossed Main Street, stopping right in front of Parker Tech's revolving glass doors. The receptionist barely looked up when Daniel explained he wanted to speak to Mr. Parker. A mechanic in dirty boots? The man behind the desk almost laughed. But just before security could shoo them out, a deep voice broke through the marble. Lobby's hush. Gregory Parker had an air about him that made even seasoned lawyers stutter. Sharply dressed, hair neat like a statue's, eyes clear as ice. He paused when he saw Daniel and Mason. For a moment, he seemed to relax, until Daniel explained. He talked about how he'd fixed everyone else abandoned, how he'd built braces for neighbors who couldn't afford replacements, how he'd stay up nights, tinkering until things worked again. Gregory's eyebrow rose higher with every word. You think you can fix what the best surgeons can't? His tone was calm but heavy. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling Mason squeeze his hand. I think maybe it's not about fixing what's broken, sir. Maybe it's about helping her use what's left. Silence settled over the polished floors. The receptionist pretended to shuffle papers. Mason's shoes squeaked on the marble. Finally, Gregory gestured stiffly to the glass elevator. Come upstairs, he said. The nurse appeared again, guiding Emma's wheelchair down the wide hallway lined with awards and framed patents. Emma's eyes widened when she saw Mason again. He grinned, waving shyly. She lifted a trembling hand, tiny fingers curling inward, like a secret she wanted to tell. They gathered in a small therapy room, bright but clinical. Machines with blinking lights lined the walls, but none seemed made for a child's size. Emma's nurse explained how the accident 2 years ago had damaged her spine. Surgeries helped her breathe and sit upright, but her hands had grown weaker, stiff from unused muscles and bulky machines too big for her tiny wrists. Daniel listened without interrupting. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor beside Emma's chair, gently placing one of his toy trucks in her lap. Emma's smile came slowly, but when it did, it was real. Gregory watched, arms folded, as Daniel unpacked scraps of cardboard, a spool of thin wire, and a battered notebook covered in scribbles. He spoke softly, showing Emma his ideas. Tiny linkages that could amplify the strength of her fingers, custom handles she could push with a slight twitch. "It's not fancy," he said to Gregory. "It's just possible." Gregory leaned back, against the wall, phone buzzing in his pocket, eyes flicking from Daniel's stained knuckles to his daughter's curious expression. He wanted to say no. He wanted to send this man back to his oil stains and cheap tools. But he didn't. Daniel worked late into the night for days after. He borrowed old parts from the garage, bike gears, plastic tubing, anything light enough for small hands. Every night, he brought Mason along. Mason sat with Emma, showing her how to twist tiny screws with what little grip she had. The nurse helped when she could, but mostly it was just the children's giggles echoing through the sterile halls, while Daniel's fingers moved like they did under car hoods, tightening, testing, adjusting, until he found what fit. He didn't bill Gregory. He didn't ask for pay. He just wanted to see Emma smile. One evening, after Mason fell asleep, curled up beside Emma's chair, Daniel showed her the first prototype, a small brace that slipped over her hand, supporting her wrist with just enough tension to help her push. It wasn't beautiful, just plastic and wire, but it was light and simple. Daniel gently fitted it on Emma's hand. She tested her fingers, eyes wide with concentration. The brace wobbled at first, then steadied. Slowly, she pressed the joystick of her wheelchair. Forward, then back, forward again. A tiny squeal escaped her mouth, shock and delight mixed in one. Gregory had watched the entire time from the hall. He didn't say a word. As Daniel packed up his toolbox, he only nodded. When Daniel caught his eye, a silent acknowledgement between two fathers, both terrified to lose what they loved most. That night, Daniel carried Mason home through the quiet streets. Stars, blinking above rusted streetlights. He whispered thanks to the empty night sky, hoping the cracked boots on his feet could keep carrying him toward a hope he never dared speak out loud until now. A week later, Daniel stood in the same bright therapy room, the new brace design balanced on his calloused palm. He'd stayed up for nights, testing lighter joints, softer linings, straps Mason had helped him stitch from old fabric scraps. Mason sat, cross-legged near Emma again, this time showing her how to press the tiny button that would unlock the brace if it pinched too tight. Emma giggled, her cheeks flushed pink when the brace popped open like a toy. Gregory watched, arms crossed, caught somewhere between disbelief and the first flicker of fragile trust. Daniel carefully slipped the brace onto Emma's hand. He explained each piece to her, patient as ever, his low voice mixing with Mason's excited instructions. The nurse adjusted Emma's chair, rolling her closer to a small wooden table. Daniel placed a soft sponge ball on the table. Emma stared at it for a moment, her fingers trembling. Slowly she pressed down, the brace amplifying her grip just enough to trap the ball between her palm and the table. The ball rolled, bumping against Mason's knee. Mason whooped with pride, clapping his hands like a kid at a carnival. Emma's laugh was quiet but real, drifting across the room and landing squarely in Gregory's chest. He felt it settle there like a spark he hadn't known he needed. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Emma's shoulder. She looked up, her eyes bright, her hair falling loose from its yellow ribbon. Gregory turned to Daniel, who was already gathering up his scattered tools and sketches. "What do you need to keep this going?" Gregory asked, his voice hushed, as if afraid speaking too loudly might break the moment they'd built together. Daniel paused, brushing a smear of grease off his jeans. He looked at Gregory, then at Emma. "I need more parts. Lightweight. One's carbon fiber, small motors, flexible joints. I need a place where I can test ideas. And he hesitated, glancing at Mason, who was now showing Emma how to roll the ball back and forth. I need to make sure she trusts that she can do this. That's half the battle. Gregory nodded, staring at the two children playing. The simple plastic brace, the bridge between two worlds that rarely touched. Gregory made a call that night. Within 48 hours, Daniel found himself standing in a corner of Parker Tech's expansive R&D lab, a place where engineers in spotless lab coats usually hovered over million-dollar prototypes. Now, Daniel's beat-up toolbox sat on a stainless steel table beside state-of-the-art machinery worth more than his house. Mason stared wide-eyed at the rows of humming 3D printers and drawers of gleaming spare parts. Emma rolled in. Behind him, her chair moving smoother than before, her new brace balanced on, her lap like a trophy she'd won with stubborn hope. Daniel worked differently now. Gone were the nights spent hunched on the dusty floor of his garage. Now, he measured micro-movements with precision cameras, tested lightweight exoskeleton ideas with tools he'd never dreamed he'd touch. Emma visited every day after her school tutoring. Mason, too, his backpack always, full of snack wrappers and comic books to keep her laughing during breaks. The engineers at first watched from a polite distance, puzzled by the single dad with oil under his nails who seemed to get more done with scrap wire than they did with whole teams. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the giant lab windows, Emma sat at a custom workbench Daniel built just for her. She clutched a pencil in her braced hand, pressing the tip to paper with a trembling grip that held firm. Mason leaned over, cheering when the first lines turned into shaky letters, her name spelled in careful, crooked capitals. "Look, Dad!" Mason shouted, waving the paper like a championship flag. Daniel looked up from the workbench where he soldered tiny circuit lines, his eyes softening when he saw Emma's shy, proud smile under her loose hair. Word spread through Parker Tech faster than any press release. Employees who'd never noticed the little girl in the CEO's car now stopped to wave when they saw her rolling through the marble halls. Some slipped tiny gifts into Mason's backpack, stickers, bright erasers, a superhero, keychain. Gregory watched it all from the top floor, torn between the hard-nosed executive he'd built himself to be and the father whose voice cracked whenever Emma asked, "Daddy, can I show you what Daniel made today?" For the first time in years, Gregory let meetings run long just to listen to her talk. One Friday evening, Daniel packed up his tools later than usual. Emma had finally managed to twist her wrist enough to pick up a small block by herself. It had taken weeks of adjustments, late-night design tweaks, and patient explanations to Emma that falling short wasn't failure, just part of the process. She hadn't cried once. When the block slipped, Mason would scoop it up, place it right back in front of her and grin until she laughed again. That night, Daniel didn't notice Gregory, watching him from the hallway, his expression soft in the glow of the exercise. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's custom braces evolved into something more. He added tiny motors controlled by simple switches Emma could tap with her pinky finger. He built lighter frames so they wouldn't tire her small arms. He repurposed discarded drone parts for smoother joints. Each version brought Emma closer to something no surgeon had promised: independence in small, life-changing pieces. One morning, she guided her own wheelchair down the long lab corridor, with a brace steadying her wrist. When she passed a group of Parker Tech execs, they stepped aside with silent respect, watching her roll by. Daniel knew they were making real progress the day Emma refused Mason's help to open her snack bag. She struggled for 5 minutes, face scrunched in fierce concentration, braces squeaking gently as her fingers pinched and pulled. Mason offered to help twice, but Emma glared at him until he backed away, arms crossed like a scolded puppy. When she finally ripped the bag open, pretzels spilling into her lap, she threw her head back and laughed so loud the whole lab stopped to smile. Daniel caught Gregory's eye from across the room. They shared a quiet nod that said everything. By late spring, Daniel's small work area looked nothing like the beat-up corner, where he'd first tinkered with scraps. Now he had a proper workbench, racks of custom parts, a neat row of finished braces waiting for tweaks. Mason had made a sign out of cardboard, Emma's helpers. It hung crooked above the tool wall, covered in sticky notes with scribbled ideas Emma had whispered to Daniel. During breaks, she wanted to pick up her stuffed bunny by herself. She wanted to hold her dad's hand without it slipping through her stiff fingers. She wanted, and Daniel built. One warm afternoon, Gregory invited Daniel and Mason to the top floor. Daniel wiped grease off his hands for the 100th time, suddenly aware of how worn his boots looked on the polished marble floors. Gregory didn't speak in the big glass office overlooking the city skyline. Instead, he handed Daniel a single piece of paper, a full-time offer, a salary that made Daniel's throat tighten, benefits for Mason, a private school scholarship that made the boy's eyes widen like the headlights of a classic Ford. But the title at the top made Daniel pause. Lead Adaptive Design Specialist. Gregory cleared his throat, voice softer than Daniel had ever heard. Emma doesn't need charity, he said. She needs someone who believes limits are just starting points. That's what you gave her, Daniel. Now I want you to give it to others too. Daniel didn't know what to say. Mason beamed up, bouncing on the balls of his feet. The little boy tugged Daniel's sleeve and whispered, "Say yes, Dad. We can help." More kids, right? Daniel looked at Gregory, then out the window at a city that suddenly seemed full of second chances. That night, as Daniel closed up his new lab for the first time, Mason raced ahead down the glass corridor, pretending to be a robot with Emma's spare brace strapped around his arm. Emma rolled along behind him, pushing herself with steady confidence, her father walking beside her with the same crooked smile she wore now. Daniel leaned against the wall, watching them disappear into the elevator, the reflection of his old boots looking sharper than they ever had under the soft office lights. He had walked in with nothing but hope and a battered toolbox, and somehow left with more.